Right, welcome to the final round recap of my Australian Championship games. I am this round playing against second seed in the tournament, International Master Trevor Tao, who at the moment is around 2360, but his peak was like 2450, I believe, but still like a very solid player, both with white and black. In general, very difficult to beat, and of course, being outrated by a few hundred points, I was not expecting this to be an easy last round game. And okay, he opened with one knight of 3 as I already had on the board. Coming into the game, I wasn't really too sure what to expect. I know he likes to vary it up. Sometimes he goes for like some sidelines with one e4 that are pretty solid. But okay, I was kind of expecting what he did in fact, which was one knight f3, and after d5, e3. I didn't really have a whole lot of time to prepare though, because this game was 10 a.m. one being the last sort of round of the tournament. They want to have enough time for prize giving later on and whatnot. So the good thing is, however, is that something like this is not super theoretical. You basically are not going to be able to do much preparation. As long as you get to a decent position, you just sort of play from there, and that's basically what happens. So knight of 6, and by the way, this is actually e3. It's an interesting move, right? Because for a long time the sort of main move was either you go c4 here, and then either black goes e6, they go c6, or they go d4, which is very ambitious, and something that a lot of ready players actually don't quite like to face. There is also g3 in this position, more of a King's Indian attack, but in recent years e3 has become a lot more popular. But the idea is now that if black plays knight f6, you go c4, and a lot of people, if they go c4 immediately, they might want to go g3 so for those people, this might not necessarily be for them, but if in this position, for example, you'd be fine going e3, it might pay to go e3 in this position so that if knight f6, you can go c4 and there's not these d4 lines. There are some extra options you allow, such as c5, which some people might not like, but okay, e3 is a very decent option after knight f6. Here I was sort of expecting c4, the logical continuation, when I'm probably going to go e6. If I go c6 and after d4, well, I'm not really a Slav player, so I'm going to end up out of book. Where on the other hand, if d4 here, this is well within the scope of my repertoire. But most players, if they play this move order, they're going to, after e6, go like b3 or knight c3. They're going to delay d4 as much as possible, maybe even forever, who knows. So yeah, okay, that's sort of what I was expecting. He had some games here, for example, I remember one like went knight c3, b6, and usually people go b3 here, but I remember seeing Trevor do something very interesting in one of his games, which I'd never seen before, which is actually to play the pawn all the way up to b4. And basically it's founded upon this sort of idea where if you just take it, there's going to be queen a4 check and you fork this and this, and this is only possible because the pawn is advanced to b6 and you can't go knight c6, right? So I was aware this was possible, but okay, like I'm not going to be that scared of b4. Okay, it's slightly more maybe aggressive, you could say, than b3. Still, you can play fairly normal moves, I think, and get like a reasonably okay game. But okay, and what he ends up doing instead is slightly interesting. He goes a3, which I think he played against Rishi Sardana, the top seed in the tournament, who I played in round 7, I believe, earlier on. And to be honest, I hadn't really looked too much at the game. I have a vague memory of maybe he did something like this in the opening, but I didn't really specifically look at this before the game, if I am being honest. And after some thought, what I end up doing is playing bishop g4. And typically, given that I'm more of a QGD type player, I usually play e6 and lock in the bishop. This kind of goes against a like normal scheme of development that I am aiming for. However, given that white had not immediately played c4 and challenged my center, not forcing me to really go e6, I felt that this would be a good opportunity to really try and shoot for the most optimal sort of development possible and get my light square bishop outside the pawn chain before I play e6. So that's what I did in fact, and I think Rishi went for bishop f5 in this game. Afterwards, Trevor said that he thought bishop g4 might be like a slight improvement. I'm not too sure, I have not analyzed bishop f5, but okay, this is what happened. c4, c6, h3, bishop h5, and this is the first interesting moment where Trevor decides, after some thinking, to take on d5. I'm pretty sure we're both on our own. Trevor, I don't think he's like a super booked up sort of player. He's not like super active these days, so I think a lot of the opening stuff he is somewhat improvising, I guess you could say. But in general, his strategy is to try and just take the opening away from something that's sort of theoretical and I've probably studied before, to something a bit more offbeat like this, where okay, he might have looked at a few things. He has like a clear plan. He wants to go b4, expand on the queen side, and get a sort of unconventional type of position. But okay, if we just develop normally from here, like I don't know, like say we do something like this, I'm going to be fairly happy. I'm going to get my pieces out to normal squares. I'm more developed, and there's not really much I can complain about. Like, okay, it's probably the game is gonna go on, but like, I'm definitely fine as black. So what Trevor decides to do is he tries to take the game into a very concrete direction, trying to maybe punish my bishop from being developed early. And there's two sort of ways you can do that. One is you can maybe like bring the queen out to b3 and attack b7. The other is you can do what he did in the game by trying to take on d5, and after it takes, you can go for some sort of bishop b5 check fiend, maybe queen a4, and try and exploit the weakness of this diagonal, where if the bishop was on c8, it would be easily able to block all of those sorts of fiends. But with the bishop all the way on h5, certain checks like this may give black something to think about, and this is what, in fact, Trevor played in the game. In hindsight, I think it might have been better to, just be a bit more chill, not try to go for black's throat. For example, like g4 would be somewhat similar to what Trevor did in the game, except concretely there's just less drawbacks. You can try and go for the bishop like this, and okay, I don't think white has an advantage, but at the very least, white's going to have some sort of strategic advantage by obtaining the bishop pair. The black can still try and make white's life a little bit difficult, I think, by trying to go like bishop e4, for example, and either white plays f3 or, white takes this, and then this d takes e4, and the knight's a little bit kind of short on squares. So, okay, that's a possibility. He ends up going for c takes d5 though, and I take back for the pawn rather naturally. If you take back for piece, well, sort of give white what they want. They get the center then, so this was principled, and we get queen a4 check. It's also worth noting if you go queen b3, then the way you defend against this is you just go queen c8, at least I believe so, where you counterattack the bishop. And now if white plays knight c3, I think you need to be a bit careful going something like e6, because then there might be bishop b5 check, knight e5, stuff like this. So I think it's important to first take on f3, take, and then go e6, and now you just go knight c6, bishop e7, develop, and I think due to white's damaged pawn structure, yes, they have the bishop here, I think the black is at least equal, maybe slightly better. So queen f4 check is what happened in the game though, and this is where I'd start thinking a little bit, because if I go, knight c6, knight e5, well, there's obviously some pressure along here, bishop b5 might be coming as well. It actually is a little bit scary. You need to be very careful about how you tread in this sort of position. So I was thinking immediately, I was like, okay, knight bd7 is probably slightly safer, but still I was thinking even in this sort of position, like white can play moves like this, you can't really go knight e5 immediately, by the way, because it's going to be queen c7, a nasty fork on the bishop and knight. So of course, if you try to take first, I'm going to take and then take back, which probably compels white to play something like knight c3 first, and after e6 only, then knight e5. And I was thinking like, okay, there's stuff like g5, bishop b5 I need to watch out for. Like, of course, the whole theme is that they're trying to like destabilize the knight here, and then overload the attack on the knight on this square. Black is still okay after something like a6, but definitely from afar it felt like, okay, I can envision something potentially going wrong in that sort of position, which sort of led me to consider a third option, which is not, by the way, queen d7. I think this is pretty suicidal after something like this, but rather instead knight fd7, which is a bit of a counterintuitive move because you are bringing the knight, you're undeveloping it in a way, and it looks rather passive, but essentially it was aimed at this whole sort of configuration of why I was aiming for g4, knight e5, bishop b5, like this whole thing, which can cause a lot of troubles against the moves I thought of. Knight b7 is okay, but knight c6 is slightly shaky. But knight fd7 is probably indeed the strongest move in this position, when it's just very difficult for white to arrange some sort of like counterattack that really leads to anything. There are some variations where, like after say knight e5 for example, they can still net the bishop here, but this really isn't so impressive just because they've wasted so much time, and their pawn structure also isn't amazing. I have to admit, during the game I actually was intending to play knight c6 here though, but it turns out to just not be that sort of impressive after bishop a6 here, and there's some line I've analyzed a bit with the computer where there's some sort of weird looking moves, and okay, the position's okay for both sides, but my entire shtick was that if I go knight c6, they're not going to have time to go g4 and like win the bishop here probably, and they can't really take twice because then I get rook c8 and I'm like skewering this, but it turns out okay, they can just play like this and somehow be okay, and so it was a bit more sensible just to go e6 and not try and do anything too special. And again, like they can't really go bishop b5 and really hurt us because we're probably just going to go bishop d6, and they can't really sustain this sort of fiend for long. But okay, what happened in the game was instead g4 in this position. It's also worth noting briefly, if white tries to go knight c3, again, we're going to take first, and then we're going to go e6, and completely fine. So Trevor tries to play a bit more ambitiously, going g4, avoiding that damaged pawn structure, and now going knight c3, because I think here for real, like knight e5, I could go e6, but I think this one, knight c6, is definitely, I'm getting away with it, because, like, essentially you have the other position where, like here I was talking about knight c6, but essentially this one, it's the same deal, but they've inserted g4, which is ultimately just a weakening move, and probably this is just a worse version of the other thing that we were discussing. So probably in this position, I haven't quite looked at this specific thing with a computer yet, but I imagine knight c6 is good. You could also, of course, go e6 probably, but knight c6, I like that the most, just challenging the knight directly on e5. What happened in the game was knight c3, and okay, the instinctual moves just go e6, allow knight e5, and, you know, white sort of gets what they want to get the bishop here, but realistically speaking, they're probably still like a bit worse just because they've spent a lot of time with their queen, their structure's a little bit off. But what I went for in the game was just even stronger, basically ignoring white's supposed threat where they're attacking d5, and I had to spend some time in this making sure I wasn't really missing anything, but you know, I saw the move pretty quickly and then spent like a bit more time just verifying, which is I played knight c6, and my whole point was that, like, okay, knight takes d5, knight c5, it's not gonna work. Like, your queen's attacked, I'm attacking this, there's like sort of e6 coming, then like I can kick the knight out and shove my knight into d3 or something, and look at all the light squared weaknesses white has. And also, if you go queen c4, then at the very least I have bishop e4, and this is actually just a very nasty fork. You can take this all you want, but now I'm just queen piece up. So yeah, not really much good that can come from knight takes d5. Intuitively, it looks like it's losing after knight c5, and if you calculate it, you'll realize it's even more losing than that. So what happened in the game was b4, in fact, and it makes sense because, like, if you just sit around and do nothing, I'm going to play knight c5, probably kick your queen out, and maybe I'll even play something like d4 or e5 and then d4. It's a very, very scary position. Sorry, I'll actually probably just play knight d3 and then stop you from castling. And how do you get rid of my bishop on d3? It's not very obvious. So what happened instead was b4, trying to stop my knight c5 shenanigans. And here I end up playing e6, which is a very natural move, but I have to admit I did spend a lot of time thinking about knight b6, and my whole idea was that if queen d1, d4, and I felt like if we make a bunch of exchanges like this, surely this cannot really be good. I have my file, actually knight takes d4, and then he takes d4, but yeah, I thought surely if we reach a position like this, can't really be good. They've made so many weaknesses on both sides of the board. Their king isn't going to have a safe shelter because of that, but actually if you put this into an engine, its conclusion is a bit different. It says that white is equal when, like, you know, this position is like -1, it's just much worse. So definitely that was a bit of a surprise looking at this afterwards, because the reason I did not go for this whole d4 theme was completely different. I was thinking of like these b5 intermediate move stuff and whatnot, and if I take, I was looking at like c2. Turns out the better move is b takes e6, and the pass one here actually is not too scary because there's stuff like e4, cutting the bishop off, and then like you isolate the pawn and you just take it basically. But yeah, long story short, this is an idea which should definitely be considered, trying to like open the position up when white has created a lot of weaknesses. They're somewhat behind in development, but it just turns out concretely this is a very strange case, so to speak, of trying to punish the opponent in a very seemingly principled way, but concretely it just doesn't really work out. And I'd guess just a large part of that is just the fact that black needs to spend a couple moves more to really castle safely on the king side, and if they don't, then there's going to be some sort of bishop b5 check. White's going to quickly castle. If we long castle as well, I believe white can play like queen e2 and long castle themselves. And again, like, their king just somehow is not that weak over on the queen side, which I still find a little bit strange, but I'm sort of wrapping my head around it, I guess, by this point. So knight b6, in the end, it was sort of the correct choice maybe to not go for that, but my reasoning and the variations that I calculated as to why were not necessarily the right ones. But okay, I go for e6 and we just develop, and basically there was a part of me that felt like maybe I let Trevor get away a little bit with his position. I felt like maybe I had something better, but objectively I was doing everything right, and I still felt like even if that was the case, like, okay, if we evaluate this position, black must be better. We have better pieces. Like if you compare our light squared bishop to their dark squared bishop, for example, was very clear that ours is very active. Theirs is shut in. Our Dark Bishop in general is also a very decent piece, and theirs is okay, but it's mostly playing defensive role of having to like look over the weak c4 square, for example, which could be used for like a knight coming into that square. So we're of course on the other hand, like ours can always be protected by a move like b6, but I end up sort of just playing a6 in this position and copying their pawn structure by playing b5. But basically my whole attitude is that even though I am creating a weakness of my own on this sort of c5 square, I believe their c4 square rather is something that can be exploited a lot easier because my knight is just a lot closer to reaching it, whereas white's one has to spend a whole extra tempo to reach the square of c5. But there were also some other things I was considering. Like only briefly I really considered this, but I was also looking at stuff like f5, but I just wasn't too sure. I think after something like bishop d3 and like if I ever take or push, then they take my bishop on g6 and they double my pawns, but realistically I can probably just back it up with something like queen e8, push f4 eventually, and if the trade of bishops ever does occur, then well again c4 really weak and I can probably shove a knight in that square. So f5 actually turned out to be the strongest move, and like when you put it on the board it makes a lot of sense because I'm going to play f4, I'm going to try and maybe exploit or maybe even take there and try and exploit the general weak white king shelter on the king side, and this was also available like further down the line as well. Like even in this position, for example, f5 was also possible. And by the way, some people might look at white castling here and think that like it's pretty bad to put the king in front of like this space where you've just played g4, but it's like, what can you really do, right? Like, are you gonna castle queenside? You're gonna leave the king in the center? Probably not, right? So castle kingside makes some sense, and it's also worth noting because the position is very close, it's not very easy for black to actually really exploit it. But again, like f5 is possible, and maybe this could be something worth considering to try and make use of that. Of course, though, you would rather the pawn being on g2. No one's gonna argue about that. But okay, I play knight b6, sticking to the game plan. This is what my whole idea was behind a6 and b5, right? I want to get a knight onto c4 at some point. Maybe not immediately. It can sort of be a situation of the threat is greater than the execution, right? Where, like, okay, knight d2 is played in the game, and if they don't play knight d2, right, like, plenty of random move on the board, I'd be very happy to go knight c4, win the knight squared bishop, and now I have a huge strategic asset of, like, just dominating the light squares. I can also maybe even consider d takes c4 as well, but you always have to confront the possibility of e4 and whether or not you would be okay with allowing this. But okay, instead of the game, knight d2, and yeah, basically, I mean, I didn't want to go knight c4 immediately because I'm like, they're gonna take and they're gonna go f4, and do I want to allow this? I didn't really think so. So I'm still better here, but didn't see the need to rush it. So what I do is I go f6, and basically my idea is that I want to play e5 and try and play in the center a bit, and after f4, which was played in the game, I spent a little bit more time just confirming that e5 is, well actually no, that's a lie. I think I spent like 1 minute on this move. It was on the next move after white played f takes, e5 takes, and d takes e5, where they so confidently took twice in the center, that I started thinking a bit more, because I'm like, well, if I take on e5, like, maybe they're gonna have some sort of knight moving, taking a pawn, discovery, attack on my knight and win, like, material, right? So I took a bit of time to think in this position, but it was also worth noting that there were some other things white could have considered, like, for example, pushing the pawn, or even just keeping the tension, like with knight b3. More on this later, though. So what happened in the game was, Trevor took, and then after this, he fought a bit more, he took, and then I fought again, where I was like, well, is there anything bad with taking? So I sat down, I spent a bunch of time. I was also thinking maybe even intermediate move, bishop g5, attacking e3, but okay, I couldn't see anything wrong with this, so I decided to logically take the pawn. And now rook takes f8 happened. When at first I was calculating queen takes f8, which is fairly logical, trying to get the queen active on the f-file, but I didn't really like this after knight takes d5, knight takes d5 takes, when I couldn't really win back the pawn because there's going to be queen b3 check, forking the knight and king. So there is also apparently bishop g5, and like black is somehow better, but okay, I kind of want to avoid that whole thing. And I was checking then bishop takes f8 to see what this was about. And of course now if knight takes d5, well, I can just take back the queen and the knight on e5 is protected. So there was another move I had to consider, knight takes b5. And the thing you have to understand about this position is if white doesn't go knight takes b5, strategically they are just absolutely screwed because they've made weaknesses all over the board. I'm maybe going to push d4, their king is weak, the piece is also probably a bit worse than black, so there's not really a whole lot good to say about their position apart from knight takes b5, which if they can just like take and win a pawn, like, you know, they're not doing too badly. I'd still reckon the black has at least enough compensation, but at least they can be like, I'm up a pawn, right? That's something, whereas in this position they have nothing. So knight takes b5 was what was played, but from afar I was calculating this, and I saw this move where I could simultaneously keep this knight under attack and protect my knight, and that wasn't queen g5, because after queen g5 I saw bishop d4, and now if I take this, well, there's still a pawn up, and maybe I have compensation, but it looks sort of unclear. So what I realized was that I can actually bring my queen to b8, and now the difference is if they go bishop d4, which actually doesn't really do anything, because the pawn isn't under attack here, well, I'm just going to win the knight. So first of all, my threats, I'm going to win the knight. Second of all, if they take this, and then I take back, well, their knight is still under attack, and if they move it, I'm going to play this, and that's losing for them. So that more or less just leaves them with the option to move the knight somewhere. So let's say they move the knight to c3, for example. Well, I was thinking I'm going to play knight d3. I attack the bishop here, and the sneaky point behind queen b8 is that I'm also hitting the g3 square, and this is where, like, even though concretely, like, maybe I couldn't exploit the weakness of this, like, king immediately, white still definitely had to be very careful long term in the event that things sort of open up, which unfortunately they were not really, and at the end of the day came down to sort of concrete calculation. But even before I concretely saw queen b8 earlier on, still intuitively it felt like this whole pawn grab thing, it shouldn't really work because the king is so weak. And what really guided me to this queen b8 move was the fact that their king was indeed weak, when again, like, knight c3, knight d3, and like if they take this, because, well, I'm threatening queen g3 and to also take your bishop. So let's say they take, I go here, and if you go king f1, like, this cannot possibly be good. And if you go king h1, well, at the very least I can give another check, which also grabs another pawn, and I can probably take this, and I am not only a pawn up, but your king is weak. My pieces can start storming your king, and not really a whole lot of good things you can say about the white position. This looks completely lost. The same also goes for knight d4. Knight d3 also works pretty similarly. I think the computer even likes like knight c4 by like 1 point more, but at the end of the day, whatever gets the job done, gets the job done. Knight f1 was played, which was very surprising that he didn't even try to go like here or here, but you know, I take the piece now after like a minute of thinking, like, is this really happening? And he took, and bishop e4, just running knight f3. He goes backwards, and I just keep going forwards. I'm up the piece, and he just decides to resign. Doesn't really want any more suffering, fair enough. And in a surprisingly like short game, I think I probably finished with around like 20-25 minutes on the clock, and maybe Trevor had about like 40 something minutes. So at least in comparison to a lot of other games this tournament, which went quite a distance, fairly short game, especially considering I won against second seed, and definitely a good sort of note to end the tournament on. So again, looking at the pairings, seeing how things unfolded, because of course this was a very important round for how the prizes unfold. Well, okay, if you're from Europe or something, you look at this would look fairly different to your average tournaments last round pairings. You have a lot of draws, you guys. Australia is pretty different. Everyone just wants to kill each other, so all on the top boards is all decisive results pretty much. And it ended up being that because Rishi, I mean, he was already guaranteed first, it was basically like sort of a clash between myself, Yi, and Frederick, who's going to get second place. If Frederick, you know, drew, then because Yi won, and I also won, we would have all shared second place. But actually, what happened was Frederick, after a very strong start in the tournament, lost his last 2 games in the last 2 rounds. Very unfortunate, and ended up tumbling all the way down to, I believe, equal 4th place with a bunch of other players on 7 points. Myself and Yi both won, ending on 7.5 out of 11, taking equal 2nd. And I actually thought I was going to get just 2nd sole place, because I looked at Yi and Kian's game, and when I looked a bit later on, Kian at least had a draw in hand. He could have taken Perpetual, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to get 2nd place for myself. But then later on, Kian pushed really hard for the win, and he was at a point where he was even very close to winning, but in the final moments of the game basically made a huge blunder where there was like this pawn race on both sides of the board. He made one wrong king move, and then he went from winning to completely losing, which meant Yi was able to win the game and take equal second, which we can see now looking at the standings. But yeah, overall, I was very happy with the finish to the tournament. Definitely not perfect by any means, no tournament ever really is, but definitely a very good feeling considering if you saw some of my results from last year's, like there was some good things mixed in there, but a lot of bad, especially the tournaments I played where I was playing a lot of lower rated players. I lost a lot of elo, so definitely instilled some confidence back in me. Probably my best tournament result for a few years, to be honest, especially because 2022 I didn't really play any chess right, and then there was like the whole COVID thing for like about 2 years, which sort of limited the amount I could play. But okay, I'm probably going to make one final video about this sort of tournament, just some reflections on it, and also like showing the rating changes and whatnot, and also talking a little bit about what I did before the tournament, because that may be useful for some people who are interested. Because definitely I think that the reason I played so well this tournament was because compared to a lot of last year, my training was a lot more dialed in. I was being like very disciplined with how I was doing things, and it might help to some people to hear what exactly I sort of did. So I'll talk a bit about that in the next video. But anyways, hope you guys found these recaps useful, and the next one I'll probably play in will be a few months, but we'll have some content in between now and then. But okay, see you guys, have a good day.